Um, these are some other important considerations just as we think about what it might mean for Minnesota Power to be owned by a private equity company. And this first one is a crucial one. Private equity firms typically hold companies for less than 10 years. So typically, private equity firms will try to double or even triple their investments in like a 4 to 6 year time window and then sell the company. So even as GIP in their application material says they are a long-term investor, we really need to interrogate what that means. Does that mean 8 or 9 years? Does I would think as someone who what would want their utility to be in good hands for my whole life, we might be thinking more 20, 30 years is like a long time. So being really clear on what a long term is, especially as we're thinking about what those investments in climate change related investments need to be made and on what timeline are they hoping to make profits off of those investments are really important considerations as we sort of look through this deal specifically. Another one, which I kind of mentioned, I know Jenna mentioned too, is that the private equity industry is really lightly regulated. So, private equity differs from other types of investors, and they're exempt from most regulatory disclosures, which means the public and even sometimes their own investors don't really have a full picture into what private equity is doing with their investments. Um, in the case of Elite right now, they are publicly traded, so they're every quarter are submitting financial disclosures to the Security and Exchange Commission, the SEC. They also have to inform the SEC of certain major changes to the company. All of that goes away with private equity ownership, and we're now relying on sort of yearly reports to the Minnesota PUC or whatever, and a lot of times the companies, the private equity firms have a lot of control over what they are disclosing to the public and what ways they are disclosing it to the public. And finally, the last thing I wanted to touch on is that private equity owned companies face high risks of bankruptcies because of the large amounts of debt that I touched on. Um, because private equity backed companies usually have more debt than publicly traded ones, they face higher risks of bankruptcy. Some of my colleagues at PSP did a report recently that found that private equity firms played a role in 65% of the largest US corporate bankruptcies during the first 6 months of 2024. And that's pretty much directly attributable to these debt loads that they're putting on companies.